understood the importance of it, but every time we interact with folks from the military, from DHS, from other government entities and the NGOs, there's greater and greater recognition of the value and importance of it, represented by the number of people out of the class that we've got here. So Ambassador Litt, to give you some of his credentials, 34 years as a career U.S. diplomat specializing in Middle East and Southwest Asia. 2005 and 6, he was one of the top-ranking officers in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. That was a pretty hot time to be there. Political military counselor, providing policy advice to the U.S. ambassador. His final assignment was a really cool one in the Marshall Center in Europe. And us from VMI, we like to call him Brother at Marshall, just to make sure you knew he's a VMI grad. But he was the ambassador in the UAE as well. Political advisor, connections to all of the entities that we need to bring together to do this stabilization, economic reconstruction the right way, has developed and led education opportunities associated with this, as well as roundtables for the organizations that are deploying. And last time we were here, a member of the class from FEMA really was captured by the discussion and said that's exactly the same sort of thing we need to do with our emergency planning and our response and how we do that. And you think about the connection between all the entities. I mean, Haiti broke down a lot of the barriers that used to exist, so it really is the way we will fight. It saves lives, not only those that you stabilize, but it saves lives of those that have to secure the area too. So that's really good.
Thanks. That's what they like?
UNC grad, as a matter of fact.
By the way. And I will tell you that this weekend I'm coming up on my 40th reunion of graduating from Carolina. It was, as you can imagine, a real treat to be asked to come to work for the Institute for Defense and Business when I retired from the Foreign Service 3 years ago. Coming back to Chapel Hill is quite a treat. As Van said, I am the Executive Director of the Center for Stabilization and Economic Reconstruction, which we humbly put into the acronym CSER. Kind of gives the flavor, the touch. I kind of miss being an ambassador, miss being a Foreign Service officer. I'm here to talk to you about stability operations and the kind of courses that we run, and talk to you a little bit about logistics in that area. But because my background is basically in part of the world that we read a lot about these days, I'm really happy to talk about any particular issue if we have time. That's on the front pages. It was one of the nice things about serving in the Middle East for a large number of years, is that you always knew that some part of the Middle East was going to be on the front page and would be of really hot interest in Washington at some time or another during your tour. So I really enjoyed being out there. But I'm not here to talk about that. I really am here to tell you that CSER was designed to expand the kind of cooperation that we find here between the military and the private sector, to go into the kind of cooperation required in the 21st century with government agencies, non-governmental organizations, humanitarian NGOs, international organizations, and so on. We find that in crisis environments, typically, all of these different organizational cultures show up in order to carry out the mandates of their operations. We have a specific interest in mind these days at CSER in putting together the expertise we have in logistics with the expertise we have in stability operations to create seminars in logistics cooperation for stability operations, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. So we have a crisis, and the crises are either disasters, natural or man-made, or they may be conflicts, and typically all of these different organizations that I talked about show up in order to do their job. And all of them usually have different mandates, they have different funding sources, they have different approaches or attitudes toward the country, the kind of operations that have to take place to help this affected population. They even have different cultures. Something that I think that General Petraeus is going to find out when he goes over to the Central Intelligence Agency is that there are two different cultures we're talking about. And as much as you may have worked together on the battlefield or back in Washington, there is something about the ethos of a culture that really makes it stand out and helps to make it operate very differently from the other groups. But not all is not lost, because it's not as if these different organizations just show up and have to work alone. They actually do work in a number of different kinds of small networks, and we're going to talk about that. So let me open this up. There we go. And I'll pull it back so that we can all see. How about that? That'll be good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about a few of the organizations that tend to show up in times of crisis. And once again, this could be a conflict, a post-conflict situation. It could be a post-disaster, whether we're talking about an oil spill in the Gulf or a set of tornadoes or hurricanes or whatever it might be. So we know that we have combatant commands. So a COCOM will be there, whether it's PACOM or NORTHCOM or CENTCOM, whatever it may be. We know we'll have also representatives from the United Nations, the various international organizations that have a responsibility for helping an affected population. Mainly in the field of logistics, we're talking about the World Food Program. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. We have the U.S. Embassy and a variety of different agencies of the U.S. government who either operate from the embassy because they are represented there, or they parachute in and set up operations within the embassy compound. We have the private sector. Never forget the private sector, who by and large, as you all know, provide the lion's share of the goods and services, the real rubber meets the road goods and services for the affected population. We have NGOs who also provide a good deal of relief of one kind or another for an affected population. And then there's one group that's missing. What might that be?
Red Cross?
Red Cross is an NGO.
Host Nation.
Host Nation is probably the most important of all of the organizational cultures that have to resolve the crisis. And a large reason for that is that host nation is sovereign. Some people say, well, you know, in these very confused times of crisis, there is nobody in charge. There's no unity of command. Well, yes and no, that's true. But there is an entity that's in charge on their sovereign soil, and that is the government of the host nation. And I would also draw to your attention, which is very important, it's not just the government, but it's also all of the other kinds of organizations that are represented in the country, whether it's the private sector, NGOs, the military of the host nation. but we think of the government as being the sovereign. And it is often overlooked as being an important part of resolving this problem. It is also often overlooked as being the entities that we really also need to help, because that's our exit strategy. It is important to help affected populations who are suffering, need medical care, shelter, food, water, whatever it may be, but we also have an obligation to help the government to get back up on its feet and resolve the problem. We have seen a range of capabilities of governments in the last year, roughly, of their capability to be able to perform those kind of services. Everything from Haiti on one end of the spectrum, arguably even before the crisis, before the earthquake, was unable to provide for its people. You have, on the other end of the spectrum, Japan. The government of Japan, really very, very capable, one of the highest developed countries in the world, and yet having a lot of problems coping with this tremendous catastrophe. Alongside it, the government of Chile in its earthquake. Very capable, really didn't need much help from the outside world. And then you had the government of Pakistan during the floods of last year, in which the government of Pakistan relied a lot on its own military forces and also the external world to come in to help it. So a variety of capabilities. Now, as I said, these different organizations just don't operate on their own. They do operate in networks of some form. Let's say, for example, the U.S. Embassy has direct connectivity with the host nation government on a regular basis. Similarly, the U.S. Embassy, usually through the Office of Military Cooperation, will have direct connectivity to the combatant command on a regular basis. And that's a good foundation for the kind of cooperation that could take place. In fact, a lot of the agencies within U.S. embassies now have representation at COCOM headquarters, which is a change, a very welcome change. You have, for example, USAID having development officers, development specialists, seated in the headquarters, senior USAID officers seated in the headquarters of our geographic combatant commands. NGOs often work with USAID, and they'll work with international organizations who hire them to perform jobs, because rarely will you have UNICEF or World Food Program or others actually doing work on the ground like the U.S. government agencies. They will hire contractors, many of whom are NGOs, but they also could come from the private sector. So you will have this kind of connectivity between international organizations and private companies. Of course, you'll have sometime the COCOMs hiring private contractors to perform some of the duties required. And U.S. Embassy will work also with private corporations, as will USAID and so on. So you will have a series of different networks. Part of the problem is that these networks don't work well together. And we find all sorts of gaps and redundancies and miscommunications and misperceptions that abound in times of crisis. And that, I would submit to you, is part of the real problem that we need to resolve, especially when we talk about logistics during a crisis. And that's one of the things that our seminars are designed to improve. So what are some of the obstacles to effective execution of the mandates of the organizations? What are some of the obstacles that they find on the ground?
Appropriations.
Big money?
No authorized to spend Title 10 on monetary aid.
Yeah. So rules and regulations about spending money.
Different missions and different, when you say different, and the different missions they have,
again, where they get their funding streams, so in some of it they can't use military resources, or they can't use assets like, say, the Children Oxfam Merlin.
Absolutely. Missions and mandates. A lot of the NGOs, for example, especially faith-based NGOs, are prevented by their mission statement from working with military organizations. So just can't do that. Some people have certain missions. We are there to help the health and wealth, the health, the medical issues. We're not there to deal with bridges. We as the U.S. Treasury, let's say, will be there to help reestablish a banking system or that sort of thing, but we're not there to do other things. So missions and mandates often are different. Yeah.
Timing, how quick somebody can get there to help.
Okay, so what would be an obstacle to timing? Why can't everybody get there pretty much at the same time?
It's not secure, it's not safe, transportation's not set up, airport.
Okay, so we have security. We have the infrastructure. That is how well prepared is the airport, the airfield. We saw that in Haiti.
Transportation limitations as far as rail or the depth of water if you're going to do a ship reload, if it's a blue water ship or a brown water ship.
Right, so airports, seaports. That's my own thing. Yeah. And rail, trucks, roads.
Yeah.
Now, what about cooperation? How we're trying to get to what prevents Team A from cooperating with Team B, and they don't. They're just not working together. They're not. What's sorry?
Culture.
Culture. What do we mean about culture? We talked about that a little bit. What is it about culture that prevents cooperation?
Trust and information sharing.
We'll get to that in a second. I'm going to get back to this issue of culture. What is it about culture? Can anyone give me an example of how different cultures perceiving things in a different way may prevent cooperation? Please.
Some countries prefer to be self-reliant. For example, the recent one with Japan, they did not want to ask for help first, so they want to take care of themselves before they come to us. So I think it's independence from others.
Yeah, certainly a host nation's political culture, aside from social culture, the political culture sometimes impacts their ability to really request the kind of help that's necessary and for cooperation. Myanmar, Burma, the cyclone that took place there, Nargis, was another example. They said, they closed their doors, say, sorry, we don't need anybody's help, thanks very much. Afghanistan is on the other end of the spectrum. Please, yes, come right away. And Haiti, same thing. What about these organizational cultures among the various groups that I had? What are some of their impediments?
You know, everybody's used to being in charge. Your co-coms are used to being in charge. Your embassy is used to being in charge. Private sector, nobody tells me what to do.
Right.
So you have a rank and file structure.
Command and control. Who's in charge? And we NGOs certainly do not want the military to be in charge of us. Not only that, we don't even want the military to consider getting out of the uniform in order to look like us. Please don't do that.
In Pakistan, we actually, in here, we always talk collaboration and cooperation, not command and control, because the interagency doesn't like that. But in Pakistan, we had to wear civilian clothes, work out the embassy, and then we go to prime minister's residence and other places. But it was always in civilian clothes, unless we were going and engaging with the military. In Haiti, they did not want to, in a lot of cluster meetings, it came back that we could put one DOD person because they were worried about we would overstep the bounds and take over meetings.
Right. What other kinds of there's one cultural issue that we haven't talked about, and that is a sense that the military look for an end state. We have an objective to achieve, a mission to achieve, and then we need to be able to move, go on, and go home or go somewhere else. There are a lot of issues entailed in being able to close up shop, move things out or leave them there to make those kinds of decisions, but ultimately to find the point in time where we can say we're over. For the State Department, that doesn't exist. The State Department is there to stay. USAID, their mission is to be in the country and remain in the country along a spectrum of different kinds of activities. Some may be emergency, immediate, and critical. Others may be medium-term development, such as rehabilitating, let's say, electrical infrastructure, water systems, sewage systems, the ability to get a country back up and running, not just dealing with medical, food, water, shelter, the immediate relief needs, but to be able to clear roads and develop or repair bridges. And then to go beyond that, to put an economy that has been crushed by a disaster or a conflict back up on its feet in order to provide the kind of economic growth necessary to generate the kind of employment and to put the country back on its regular track. But that issue of employment is also important to deal with a lot of other issues like security and like the frustrations of people who want answers quickly, who want goods and services quickly and aren't getting them. So a lot of different things that blend together for agencies sitting in U.S. embassies who are there to stay, who are not there to move on. Same is true for a lot of NGOs who have established operations in a country and happen to be there when disaster strikes. So there's that kind of cultural misunderstanding.
I wanted to ask you just your perspective on, when we talked about not having a common agreement on a transition point. At least within the government organizations, Department of State, Department of Defense, I mean, would you agree or not that at least transitioning from phase 3 to phase 4 ops would be at least a mark on the wall, a natural point where you could see a transition from the military starting to leave, Department of State maybe picking up more of the weight of the operation. And I can easily see how maybe the NGOs or maybe the IOs they don't talk that taxonomy or that construct, but at least within the government, U.S. government organizations, we can at least have an outline of the op.
Absolutely right. This is a question of how do we find that transition point so that military and civilian can perform that kind of handoff in a way that makes sense, that's effective, that's efficient, and then we can all go about our business the way our own missions and mandates call for. And the question is, therefore, is the end of major combat operations, phase 3, and the beginning of stability operations, phase 4, is that the place? Now, many have argued that that is in fact the truth. I was, Van didn't mention this, but I was political advisor to the commander of Central Command from 2002 to 2004. That would be General Franks and General Abizaid. And I can tell you that one of the really important issues in the joint discussions that we had, especially with the J5, the J3, where when we are going to determine when major combat operations have ended so that this handoff to the civilian world can begin to take place in a way that's nicely ingrained, that it's not just, okay, end of story, we all go home, we military all go home, it's over to you guys, do what you want, we don't care. Obviously, it doesn't happen that way. But I can also tell you, since I was there in 2002, the State Department and other agencies of government were fully prepared to talk about phase 3 to phase 4 way back in phase 0 at this time, recognizing that there would be requirements for USAID OFTA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, that's the lead agency of USAID and of the US government in civilian terms to come to the aid of an a crisis-affected population. Of international organizations, all the UN family that didn't really like the idea of invading Iraq, but realizing that in fact there will be work to do at the end. So there was very much a recognition that this was going to be an important transition. What happened here in the meantime was, I think, a breakdown in the kind of collaborative planning within our government to be able to apportion out tasks and jobs and this kind of thinking, what's going to happen X number of weeks or months from now when we'll have to get there. And there was a lot of interest in the definition of the end of major combat operations, which was the much vaunted appearance of the president on the aircraft carrier. It was not mission accomplished, we're over. It is major combat operations are over, which announces now we can start entering into this phase of stability operations. When you don't plan it very well over here, it doesn't work out very well over here, as we all saw in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, and so on and so forth. It got to 2007, 2008 before we really got our rhythm and began to improve that kind of collaboration. And it came out pretty well, I think, in the end. We're facing other challenges in that kind of collaboration today. But the point here is when you start in phase 0 or even phase 1, when problems begin to occur in a society that may lead to either combat operations, some sort of conflict, or a disaster of some sort. I would argue the same thing applies. Obviously, earthquakes, we don't get that much warning. But flooding, we do. Hurricanes, we do. We get several days of warning in hurricane. For hurricanes. So we can find a time here, if we are prepared enough and we have the kind of interagency, public-private sector collaboration and communication. We didn't talk about that word. That's another one we'll come back to. Ahead of time, so that we know how to integrate our various capabilities at this point, either when the hurricane has passed or the floods have receded to a point where we can deal with them, or the conflict the major combat operations are over, so that we can transition to a principally civilian operation and then move forward. I think we're getting much better at this, and I would argue that I don't know if you all are familiar, certainly FEMA is, with the Presidential Directive 8 on changing the way we think about responding to emergencies, and that is to prepare ourselves via our capabilities, not to prepare for smallpox, for a major attack on a city, a nuclear weapon, whatever it may be, but to develop our capabilities, regardless of the scenario, that will be needed, those kinds of capabilities that will be needed. So we're working a lot better these days in this part, and I think that's pretty good news. But there is still some way to go, because we still suffer from a lot of the obstacles that we talked about. Communication being an important one. Now, communications comes in a variety of different flavors. The hardest communication, I would argue, to deal with is the attitude communication. Sorry, I'm just not going to work with you. I'm not going to talk with you, la 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 la. And we get that from a lot of the NGOs who just will not talk with the military. You're all baby killers. Similarly, I have heard time and again from military officers who really ought to know better that all those NGOs, they're just tree huggers, and they just want to go off, get themselves into trouble, and then they come yelling for help. Thanks a lot. When we tried at the beginning to get them to cooperate with us, to talk with us, and they say no, and then they go off, they're useless, those people. In fact, they're more than useless. They give us other problems that we have to deal with. Not to mention the private sector. We know all those bloodsuckers. The private sector, they're all out to make money. They don't care about the people. They don't care about our nation's integrity. They just want to get money. This is the big one, attitudes. Then there are hardware problems. My radio doesn't talk with your radio. Software problems. We don't have the same software. So even though we would like to communicate, we just can't. And that's not a public-private sector or military to civilian problem. That's within the military, I'm told. I mean, you still have issues of different services talking with each other on the battlefield. Please.
How do you decide who's in control when something like this takes place? I mean, we have a whole list of folks that, from the page previous, that's got, I mean, from stem to stern, there's somebody who's applying some form of assistance, but how does that get coordinated? Who does that?
Yeah. The short answer is that it doesn't get coordinated. However, in advance of crises, the traditional partners, people who tend to show up with each other, and in geographic areas, they all know who they are. And that's especially true for our domestic crises in particular regions of the United States. The regional emergency management authorities know who are the NGOs, who are which Home Depot or FedEx or whoever can be counted on to come and help. When you can get to getting together ahead of time to talk about command and control, or at least unity of effort, or to talk about who is in this circle. In the case of overseas, that's pretty easy, that there is a host nation. And early on, it's really important to understand what is the status of the host nation and its capabilities of doing anything. And you can't do that only after the crisis happens. You really have to have a very important set of connectivity between the U.S. Embassy and the various agencies who work in a country on a regular basis with host nations. And we know which are the nations who are prone to disasters, and we know which nations are prone to conflicts. So it should be as no surprise how to network with the host nation, how to get a sense of their capabilities, report back home, hope that it doesn't get out to WikiLeaks, and then get other agencies of government to work on those capabilities, to help them to develop. COCOMs, of course, do the same thing with host nation militaries. And all of that is really good. So at the time of the crisis, we can then determine in our close collaboration with the host nation, ideally we will have exercised this beforehand, to determine where are their weaknesses, where do they want to cede temporary authority for X organization to open up their airport and run it for a while. So we saw that in Haiti, and then at a certain point there was a transition to the Haitian government taking the airport back. There were a lot of organizations, you will remember, non-military organizations, who railed against the Air Force and railed against the military for the way they were controlling the airport, and I couldn't get my goods in, and they were just allowing military aircraft and not civilian aircraft, and they railed until the Haitian government took over. And then they said, oh gosh, why does the military take it back? I mean, this is just hopeless. We can't get anything through there because of all the red tape and all this. So there are capabilities of a host government that are good, and some of them are not so good. Back in the back, yeah.
You touched on, I guess, looked at the media as a form of communication and control, and both barriers and with the pluses and minuses of the whole media affair with journalists, and I guess there are similar NGOs, but maybe not. But they're
Not.
separate entities.
Yeah. The media are very much part of the private sector. The media, by and large, except for perhaps National Public Radio, BBC, the French radio, German radio, and so on, the media perform an incredibly valuable task. And not everybody sees it that way. It's really important to bring the media in as a partner. Now, I don't mean that you collaborate with them, because they don't want to, they're like NGOs. And they're like the military, like the US military does not want to cede command authority to any other nation. So the media want to run their operations the way they run their operations. But they do very much want to cooperate, collaborate, understand what is going on, and how can they play a more useful role to get information to the people who need it, which may be way out here, out in the general publics, where they report from, or to all the various agencies, to be a little bit of glue, to get information to everybody, or even to get information into the host nation, so that people who listen to BBC Radio, for example, or to an American radio station because they can get that in Haiti, or a television station, they can get more information from the media. It is critical that the media be included as one of the players in here, because they are there on the ground, whether we like it or not. They will be there. They have a job to do. Now, these days, and I'll get back to your question in a second, these days, it's not just the media providing information, is it?
Facebook, Twitter.
Now we have crowdsourcing. So we have innumerable sources of data. Not all of it's valuable information, but it's all data that comes to everyone. It's everywhere. And there are ways to capture SMS texts, Facebook, Twitter feeds, all sorts of YouTube, all sorts of sources of data onto common platforms so that people can access them. That's going on, and that's really good news. We saw that big time in Haiti, and it carried on in Pakistan. And I'll bet dollars to donuts that it was also an important feature in Japan. Getting information to lots of people. Now, this is also often combined with geospatial imagery, so that a raft of Twitter feeds or text messages from a refugee camp or a refugee population saying, we have moved, we're getting out of here, we're moving downrange to another location, can be extremely important if it can be co-located on using geospatial imagery, so that the NGOs who have to, or private sector who have to deliver, let's say, goods to a refugee camp now know that it's no longer there. It's moved. It's now in this new coordinate location. So crowdsourcing is a new feature of the communications landscape, which everyone is working to improve, to develop software, hardware, and then that all important attitude to share information. All is not lost just because there's no commander in charge. There are plenty of kinds of social phenomena where things get done efficiently even though there's nobody in charge. And you look at, over the long term, things like the stock market, the private sector. There's nobody in charge of any of those things, but because of the exchange of information and because of rules and regulations, by and large, things happen in the direction that they're supposed to go. Somebody else had a question over here.
I have a question. On your previous slide, you talked about when you assess a country's infrastructure, their airports and their, how do you, in places like Iran or someplace where they're not friendly, how do you discuss their energy capabilities and their intent with North Korea? They have nuclear capabilities, but how do you dance that line between capability and potential, adverse effects for a biological or nuclear weapon?
So the question then is, how do we help a nation that may be developing its, or maybe
Well,
under...
if, for example, North Korea and Iran, both places have nuclear capability.
Right.
How do you, when you're assessing their nuclear, or their electronic infrastructure,
Right.
their electronic grids and stuff, and
It's
their
hard to get
intent,
information.
yeah, if they have an ulterior motive behind it, I mean, how do you dance that line?
Right. Let's, to put that in the context of a crisis environment, because in phase 0, there are lots of issues involved with collecting information about infrastructure on countries that are adversarial, because they don't want people to get that kind of information. But let's say for Myanmar, we need to know about their port capacities, or we need to know about the functioning of the airport or the electricity systems. They don't want people knowing about that kind of stuff. Or with Iran, for example, there was an earthquake in Bam in southeastern Iran that some of you may have remembered. CENTCOM offered to help, and the answer back from the Iranians was thanks but no thanks, but other people could get in help. Myanmar was the same thing, as I mentioned. And there it was the United Nations that was able to sit down with the Myanmar authorities and try to work with them to get the kind of information that they would certainly not give to the United States or any other NATO ally or the Australians. So it was, in those kinds of situations, we need to find the kinds of interlocutors that the host nation will trust in order to get the right kind of information. And that means developing the kinds of diplomatic ties as well as the ties between certain NGOs like the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders, who make a point about their independence just for times like this, when we really need some data, good information in order to help the country.
So how do you get past the language barrier when you pick a nation, when something happens and all these entities are coming together? Is there a group of interpreters, or is there, how do you, I'm sure not everybody speaks every language, so all these people are trying to rush in and help. How do you get past finding some way to commonly communicate with each other?
This is my big pet peeve, is not understanding each other's languages. I think by and large in the international humanitarian relief community, English has become a lingua franca, even for Doctors Without Borders. I suppose that in certain Francophone areas, that French also becomes a lingua franca, because just so many people who have knowledge and skills about a country in Francophone Africa, for example, will gravitate, because we tend to depend so heavily on our interpreters and translators in conflict situations, when knowing what our interlocutor is saying is really, really important. And for some reason, we tend to go to places in conflict where they speak a language that not a whole lot of people speak, like Pashto or Dari in Afghanistan. Now, my wife and I went to Afghanistan in the late 1970s, so we studied Dari, so we could speak Dari. In fact, she went back to the embassy in 2005 when I went to Baghdad because she spoke Dari. But by and large, we don't have a large cadre of people who speak Dari. I also learned Arabic because of my service in the Middle East, and I can tell you that when I went around with General Franks and also General Abizaid to listen to, especially in the early period, 2003, to hear interpreters who captured maybe 30% of what the interlocutor was saying. And that's just not enough. Now, we have developed, I think, over the course of time, a larger cadre of professional interpreters, and that's really important. But we can't just rely on our Dari speakers, because the next crisis may be in Yemen, and we need Arabic speakers, and really good Arabic speakers too. Or it may be in Somalia again. So I would argue that as a nation, we need to have a capability of looking ahead into the future to see what language groups or language capabilities will we likely need over the course of the next decade or 2 decades, and begin to emphasize education and training in those languages for our professional cadres, for people who just join the military, Department of Treasury, USAID, and so on, or in our universities and high schools. I would say this is really important for our national capability, because you can't depend on an interpreter who may miss a whole lot.
Thank you, appreciate it.
And now I get off my soapbox now.
I have a question.
Please.
The relationship between the State Department and the military seems to be some friction. And to improve that communication, during a recent visit to the State Department, they said they were going to bring some of the military into the State Department. Question there is, how does that impact your diplomatic relationships, whereas the military is not reaches an end state very quickly and move on? So just your views on it.
Yes, the question is about the relationships between the military, the Pentagon writ large, and the State Department, and the frictions and tensions that may have existed, and the notion that the military was going to be sending a lot of officers to the State Department to work there. How does that add to or enhance the friction, or perhaps improve communications? Did I get the sense of it right?
And that becomes militarization of the State Department.
Right. Are we seeing a militarization of the State Department? On that last point, I just want to mention one thing, if I ever get to it, about the logistics seminar that we have. Similar number of folks like you, about a dozen from the military, a dozen from government agencies and international organizations, and a dozen from the private sector and NGOs. And I thought that we would have our military culture nicely corralled in that dozen, and that everybody else would be civilian. What I found was so many people in the civilian world working in crisis, in the NGO world working in crisis, and of course in the private sector working in crisis, all had former military backgrounds. It seems like everybody's military these days. So, but getting to your point about the physical cooperation between state and defense, this is something that actually has been going on for quite a long time. And of course, as you can imagine, the Defense Department has a whole lot more people to draw on to go over to the State Department than vice versa. So you have the Pentagon, which has lots and lots of people available to go over to this little State Department. And they do. And it is a very good thing, because we get not only better understanding of military officers about the State Department culture, what does the State Department do, but also we get channels of better cooperation the other way, so that DoD begins to understand what is overwhelming for this poor little State Department. Where should the Pentagon back off in its requests for more State Department officers doing this, more speakers, more people to participate in exercises, to get some better understanding the other way. The technology transfer, if you will, is also valuable, because now the State Department learns about the benefits of planning and exercises and training and education. That was something that we really didn't understand very well, and Colin Powell was perhaps the first Secretary of State that really hammered away on the importance of human resource development within the State Department and the importance of education and training, and therefore that the State Department needs to have more than just 6,000 officers worldwide. This is not enough to do worldwide diplomacy. So he asked for an increase of a couple of thousand more, in large part to provide not only staffing, adequate staffing for all of our embassies and consulates and other kinds of missions and the State Department, but to have a training float so that Foreign Service officers could go to the Army War College, spend a year there, or go to other kinds of training where they're not penalized for getting out of their regular career cycle and spending wasted time in education. They're learning that education is a valuable thing. Unfortunately, this number was pretty much gobbled up in Iraq and Afghanistan, so we no longer have the kind of great training float that we used to. But Secretary Clinton is working on that again, to start that ball rolling again. And of course, with budget problems, now we're looking at cutting back again. So it's really a mess. But I think to answer the question the long way about, this is a valuable, useful cooperation between those two agencies that will be only for the benefit of the country as a whole. And understanding that until this gets to be much bigger, that and the Pentagon does not have to get smaller, it just needs to be able to dedicate resources to its basic missions and not to the missions that these guys ought to be doing or commerce ought to be doing. Paul Brinkley of the Task Force for Business and Stability Operations is doing the Lord's work, in my view, to bring business, commerce, investment to a variety of countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. But that's not the job of DOD. That's the job of, in my view, the Department of Commerce or other parts of our government. So until the Pentagon can really get back to its basic missions and the missions of the future and let State Department be State Department, we're going to be in the trouble we are. And I guess the good news for the private sector is that therefore, the private sector will continue to do all of the jobs that Pentagon will no longer be able to do, and State Department isn't capable of doing, or USAID is not capable of doing because of human resources. So we will increasingly depend on the private sector to actually physically do the work that has to be done.
This is probably our last question.
This is probably our last question.
We've created, and I guess this kind of wraps up a little bit of it. We've created joint interagency coordination groups that most of the combatant commands to provide some of this communication, but it's not doctrinally, codified, and there's no credit given by a State Department person filling this position, or Commerce, or FBI, or you name it. Is that something that we ought to do, kind of like we did, 20 years ago, making joint something that the services thought was heresy, now something common? Is that something we ought to do? And this is just the baseline for that.
Yeah. One State Department lieutenant colonel talking to another saying, "Oh, what embassy are you going to?" "Oh, I'm going over to Transcom." "Where?" "Yeah, I'm going to be part of the JIASIC." "The what?" "Why are you going to do that? What did you? Oh, did you really piss somebody off? Is that?" No, absolutely. And this is also something that's been in the works for about 10 years, is to develop that kind of interagency capability within combatant commands that where the personnel have some authority, and they can speak on behalf of their home agency. That never became the case, or it didn't. It's certainly in its up until recently. I don't know the situation these days. I think that the importance of having an LNO, let's call it the way it is, a liaison officer embedded in a military headquarters, That concept is becoming increasingly valuable to agencies like DHS and like USAID and certainly the State Department. So it's becoming more and more accepted. But until it's rewarded in terms of promotions and in terms of future assignments, it won't go very far. I don't know the extent to which that is happening. It may be. It certainly would be helpful to be codified doctrinally, as you suggest. And I know that there was a bill presented in Congress by Ike Skelton, who's no longer in Congress, unfortunately, as well as a congressman from Kentucky, Jeff Davis, who presented a bill to develop this kind of national capacity, exactly as you are suggesting. I don't know where that's headed, but I know that there was a lot of sense that this is an important kind of international capacity for us to develop with interagency sharing and making sure that those billets are valued and important and that they're planned out and so on and so forth. So we are headed in that direction. That's the good news. We're not there yet. So, and Congress has a big role to play in all of this. So.
Well, thank you. You did so well, David, that we're going to double your usual fee.
All right. That's right. Okay, chapters 9 and 10 tomorrow.